The air inside the grand hall was still, almost heavy with expectation. Tall silver pillars rose on each side, stretching toward a high ceiling made of crystal panels. Soft blue light filtered through, casting the chamber in a calm glow. It was a place designed to impress, to make visitors feel both welcomed and slightly overwhelmed. Human soldier David stood at the side of the main path, his posture straight, his hands resting lightly on the handle of his ceremonial blade. He was part of the human honor guard assigned to this event, the first face-to-face peace meeting between the United Human Alliance. In the Varian Empire in over 50 years, David had been in battle before. He had seen smoke-filled skies, heard the roar of engines, and felt the ground shake under bombardments. Today was different. There were no explosions here, no shouting, no chaos, yet he still felt a different kind of tension in his chest. This was history in the making, and he was standing in the middle of it. At the far end of the hall, the doors opened with a slow, deliberate motion. From the corridor beyond, a small procession entered. At the front walked Varian guards, tall and thin, wearing silver armor that shimmered as they moved. Behind them came advisors in flowing robes. And at the center, walking with unhurried steps, was Princess Nara of Varia. She was taller than most humans, her form graceful and almost ethereal. Her skin had a faint golden hue, and her eyes were a deep shade of green that seemed to catch the light in a strange way. Her hair was gathered in a long braid, woven with delicate strands of silver thread. She carried a ceremonial staff, its top shaped like a blooming starflower, the symbol of her royal house. From the moment she entered, David could sense something unusual about her. She walked as if every movement was measured, her head held high, her gaze forward. Yet there was a flicker in her eyes when she glanced, just for a second, toward the human soldiers standing guard. She had been told many things about humans, that they were clever, but quick to anger, that they were resourceful, but unpredictable, that they were strong, but dangerous, and now, here she was, standing only a few meters away from one. David kept his expression neutral, as he had been trained, but his eyes met hers briefly. It was not a long stare, just a fraction of a second. Still, something passed between them, a small recognition, like the first note of a song. The delegation moved toward the central table, a large oval of polished stone. Representatives from both sides took their seats. The air seemed to grow, even quieter, as though the hall itself was holding its breath. The first words spoken were formal greetings. Voices were calm, polite, and careful. Each side knew the importance of what was happening here. But while the officials spoke, David noticed something. Every now and then, the princess's gaze would shift toward him. It was never obvious, only when others were focused elsewhere. She was doing her best to remain composed, her posture perfect, her tone steady. Yet inside, her thoughts were not still. She could feel a faint, quick rhythm in her heartbeat, one that had nothing to do with fear of the meeting's outcome. There was something about the presence of that human soldier, the way he stood so still, his eyes sharp but not unkind, that unsettled her calm. David, for his part, tried not to think too much about it. He had a job to do: stand guard, remain alert, protect the delegates if needed. But in the corner of his mind, he found himself wondering why the alien princess's eyes seemed to linger on him. Was it curiosity, distrust, or something else entirely? The talks continued. Papers were exchanged. Small gifts were presented. The Varian advisors spoke in soft, flowing tones, their words translated instantly by discreet devices at the table. Human representatives replied in clear, direct speech through it all. David stood silent. He was aware of every movement in the room, every shift of the princess's hands on her staff, every subtle change in her breathing. She was good at hiding her emotions, better than most humans he knew. But even the best masks had small cracks. Nara could feel his gaze too, though he was careful not to make it obvious. She told herself it was only natural to be cautious around a human soldier. She told herself the tightening in her chest was just the weight of the political moment. But deep down, she knew those explanations were incomplete. When the first break in the talks was called, The delegate stood and began moving toward a side area for refreshments. David remained at his post. The princess passed near him, her steps quiet on the polished floor. She didn't look directly at him this time, at least not in a way that anyone else would notice, but her eyes shifted just slightly in his direction for a brief instant. Their gazes met again. It was not a smile, not even a nod, just a moment of silent acknowledgement between two people from worlds far apart. And in that quiet exchange, something unspoken began to form. Neither could name it yet, neither knew what it would mean. But it was there, subtle as the faint hum of the crystal lights above them, and it would grow, no matter how hard they tried to ignore it. The meeting resumed, but the air between them had changed. The grand hall had grown quieter after the first session of talks. The main voices now belonged to the translators, speaking in low tones to ensure that both sides understood every word. The tension was still present, but it had shifted. It was no longer the sharp, cautious energy from when the meeting began. Now it was something slower, more watchful, like two sides circling each other and testing the ground. David remained at his post, standing beside a tall silver column. He had a perfect view of the delegates at the main table, but his attention was not only on the officials. It often drifted toward the tall figure seated near the center, Princess Nara. Her expression was calm, her eyes focused on the human ambassador who was speaking. She rested both hands lightly on her ceremonial staff, her shoulders straight, her chin held high. If anyone looked at her, they would see the image of composure. But David had been trained to notice details others missed. He saw the way her fingers moved slightly, almost as if she was tracing invisible lines on the staff's surface. He noticed the faint, measured breaths she took whenever the talks reached a delicate subject, and most of all, he noticed how, every so often, her gaze would shift, just slightly, toward him. It was never long, never enough to be caught by anyone else. But it happened often enough for him to be sure it wasn't an accident. From her side of the table, Nara saw the soldier standing like a stone pillar. His armor wasn't flashy, but it looked strong, practical, made for function, not display. His eyes were steady, scanning the room without rest. She wondered how long he could stand like that without moving. Humans, she knew, were physically strong, but endurance of that kind was not something she had expected to see in such a quiet form. Her advisor spoke in her language, their tones smooth, their sentences long. The human delegates replied with short, clear statements, their translators adding gentle pauses between words. Nara listened carefully to every exchange, but her mind kept returning to the human soldier. She reminded herself that he was here simply as part of the guard. He had no role in the decisions being made. Still, there was something about him, something she could not quite name, that unsettled her calm. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself. She had seen soldiers before, both in praise and on distant battlefields during inspection tours. Many tried to appear strong, but their eyes gave away nervousness or pride. This one's eyes were different. They were sharp, yes, but there was also a steadiness in them, a kind of quiet confidence that made her feel safer. She shifted slightly in her chair, adjusting her posture. The movement was small, but David noticed. His training told him not to react, but part of him wanted to step forward, to check if she was uncomfortable. He stayed still. The talks moved on. A Varian advisor presented a detailed chart of trade routes. The human ambassador countered with maps showing neutral zones. Numbers, dates, and proposed agreements filled the air. But David's focus remained half on the discussion and half on the princess. At one point, she reached for a crystal goblet filled with water. Her hand moved with the same grace as all her actions, but David saw a faint tremor in her fingers before she touched the glass. It was so small that even the guard standing nearest to her would have missed it. David told himself it was none of his business. She was royalty. She had her own guards, her own protection. But something about that tiny movement stayed with him. Was she nervous, or was it simply the strain of the day? Nara sipped the water slowly, then set it back down. She kept her eyes on the human representatives, but inwardly, She was aware of the soldier's watchful gaze. She found it strange. She did not feel threatened by it. If anything, it felt reassuring. The meeting reached a short pause while documents were exchanged for review. The hall's atmosphere softened slightly, though no one truly relaxed. David took the moment to scan the entire room again. Valyrian guards stood near the walls. Tall and elegant, their armor polished. Human guards matched them in number, their stances firm but not aggressive. The translators spoke quietly with the scribes, and the ambassadors leaned toward each other in muted discussion. His eyes returned to the princess. She was speaking softly with one of her advisors, her voice carrying a tone of calm authority. Yet when the advisor turned away to review a document, she glanced toward David again. This time, her gaze lingered for the briefest heartbeat longer before shifting back to the table. David did not smile. He did not nod. But he felt a faint, unexpected warmth in his chest. The second half of the session began. The topics turned to security arrangements and shared technology. These were sensitive matters. Both sides were cautious. Nara listened carefully, her mind focused on the words. But the soldier's presence remained like a quiet weight in the background of her thoughts. She reminded herself that composure was her duty. A princess could not appear distracted, yet here she was, aware of every shift in the soldier's stance, every subtle tilt of his head as he listened to the room. She wondered if he was aware of her in the same way. The day's talks ended at last. The delegates rose from their seats. Formal words of parting were exchanged for the evening. Guards from both sides moved into formation for the walk back to the guest quarters. As the Valyrian delegation began to move, Nara passed by David once again. She kept her face calm, her eyes forward. But as she stepped past him, the faintest turn of her gaze met his. This time, it was not an accident, and though not a single word was spoken, both knew they had noticed the other, and that this quiet awareness would not fade easily. The second day of talks began much like the first. The grand hall was calm. The delegates seated at the long oval table, their voices steady as they worked through the day's agenda. Outside, the skies over the neutral zone were clear. No ships were allowed to pass without clearance, and both the Human Alliance and the Valyrian Empire had stationed patrols to maintain order. David stood in his assigned place, near the same tall silver column as before. His focus was on the room, but his senses were tuned for anything unusual. As a soldier, he knew that peace meetings often attracted those who wanted to disrupt them. Princess Nara sat at the table, her posture perfect, her voice composed when she spoke. But every now and then, she would catch sight of the human soldier. It was not intentional, or so she told herself, but his presence was strangely grounding. The discussion was deep into a debate about shared mining rights when it happened. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the hall. Not loud at first, more like a distant crack of metal. Most ignored it, but David's head turned slightly, his instincts already awake. Then came the alarm. A deep, pulsing tone echoed through the hall, followed by flashing strips of red light along the walls. The human and Valyrian guards immediately stiffened. A voice came through the overhead speakers, urgent and clipped. Security breach detected. Unidentified drones in the outer courtyard. All personnel stand by. The Valyrian advisors looked at each other in confusion. The human delegates exchanged quick, tense glances. David was already moving. He stepped forward, scanning the hall for the source of the threat. The main doors sealed themselves automatically, the heavy panels sliding into place. A second alarm joined the first, this one higher in pitch, signaling danger at close range. The princess kept her expression calm, but her heart rate quickened. She turned toward one of her own guards, but before she could speak, David's voice cut in firm. "Steady, Your Highness. Stay close to the inner wall." It was not a request. It was an order given in the tone of someone who had faced danger many times. For a moment, Nara almost wanted to protest, but something in his voice told her it was the right thing to do. The wall at the far end of the hall shuddered as a series of heavy impacts struck from outside. Everyone could hear the faint mechanical whir of the machines beyond. "Hostile drones," one of the human guards muttered. The Varian captain's voice rose above the noise. Evacuate the princess, now. A hidden door near the dais slid open, revealing a narrow side passage. Nera's guards moved toward it, but David was already in position beside her, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his chest. Move, he said simply. The princess stepped into the corridor, her staff in hand. The passage was dimly lit, the air cooler than the main hall. Behind them, the sound of metal tearing echoed faintly, followed by a crack of gunfire as the hall's defenders engaged the drones. Nara glanced back once, through the half-closed door. She caught a glimpse of silver shapes forcing their way inside, tall, insect-like machines with glowing red optics. Then the door sealed completely, cutting off the view. They moved quickly. Through the passage, the sound of boots and armor ringing softly against the metal floor. Where does this lead? David asked without looking at her. To the inner courtyard, Nara replied. From there, we can reach the secure wing. David nodded. How many guards in the courtyard? 4. She said. Not enough, he muttered under his breath. They rounded a corner, the corridor widening slightly. David's eyes kept scanning, his body moving with controlled precision. Nara noticed that even in this tense moment, he did not rush blindly. Every step was measured, every turn checked before he passed it. A faint metallic noise came from ahead. David raised a hand, silently signaling for the group to halt. He stepped forward slowly, his rifle now in his hands. The sound grew clearer, the steady, mechanical click of metal feet against the floor. A drone emerged from the shadows ahead, its spindly frame carrying a mounted weapon. It turned its head, sensors locking onto them. Down, David barked. The Varian guards reacted instantly, pulling the princess back as David fired. The shot rang through the corridor, striking the drone in the chest. Sparks burst from its frame as it stumbled, but it did not fall. Another shot, this one straight into its optics, and the machine collapsed in a heap of twitching metal. David lowered his rifle slightly, but didn't relax. We keep moving, he said, his voice even. Nara followed, her staff ready. She had not been in direct danger like this before, but she found herself matching his pace without hesitation. Her mind was alert, her senses sharp. The corridor finally opened into the inner courtyard. Above, the sky was visible through a circular opening. The blue light of Varian daylight streamed down, but the peace of the courtyard was shattered by movement. 3 more drones, skittering across the marble floor. The Varian guards engaged, firing energy bolts from their weapons. David joined in, his rifle's sharp cracks blending with the hum of alien energy blasts. 1 drone fell, then another, but the third lunged forward, aiming directly at Nara. She froze for a fraction of a second, but David was already there, stepping between her and the attacker. He fired point blank, the recoil pushing against his shoulder. The drone crashed to the ground, smoking. For a brief moment, the courtyard was still. The air smelled faintly of ozone and scorched metal. David turned to her, his expression unreadable. Stay close. We're not safe yet. Nara nodded, her voice steady despite the quickened beat of her heart. Lead the way. They moved toward the secure wing, the sound of distant alarms still echoing behind them. Whatever had brought the drones here? The peace talks were no longer just words on paper. They were now tied to survival itself. And for the first time, the princess found herself not just thinking about diplomacy, but about the human soldier who had stood between her and danger without a second thought. The secure wing was quieter than the rest of the palace, but David didn't trust the silence. He had seen too many battles where quiet was only the pause before the next strike. Princess Nara led the way through a wide hall lined with smooth, white walls. The light from the ceiling reflected softly, giving the space a calm look. But that calm didn't reach David. He kept his rifle ready, eyes scanning for movement. Varian guards followed close behind, one slightly limping from the fight outside. Nara slowed her pace a little so the injured guard could keep up. David noticed, but he also noticed how she still held herself tall, determined not to let fatigue show. This wing connects directly to the command center. Nara said in a low voice, "From there, we can contact the outer defense network." David gave a short nod. "How far?" 5 halls, she replied. They made it halfway down the first hall when the lights above flickered. The hum of the ventilation system faltered for a moment, then returned. David's grip on his rifle tightened. They're inside the palace systems, he said. They might shut the doors on us. Before Nara could answer, a harsh clanking echoed from the hall ahead. The sound was metallic, heavy, and fast. Contact, David warned. The group moved back toward a side room, but before they could enter, 3 large drones appeared from the far end of the hall. These were different from the smaller ones outside. Heavier, with thick armor and twin cannons mounted on their shoulders, the first drone fired, its blast searing the wall where David had stood a second earlier. He returned fire immediately, aiming for the gaps between the armor plates. The Valyrian guards added their energy bolts, filling the hall with flashes of red and white light. One drone's cannon sparked and failed under the combined fire, but the others advanced without slowing. David dropped to one knee, firing in short bursts. Aim for the joints, he called out. Nara had moved back toward the side room, but she didn't retreat completely. Instead, she pressed her staff to a wall panel. With a deep chime, a faint shimmer appeared in the air. A thin energy barrier stretching across the hall behind the group. Fall back point, she said. If they break through us, the shield will slow them. David glanced back at her. Even under pressure, her voice was steady. Good thinking, he said before turning back to fire again. The fight grew louder, the air heavy with the smell of scorched metal. One guard was knocked down by a blast, his armor dented. Nara moved toward him, but David stepped in front, blocking a shot meant for her. The impact hit his shoulder plate hard, but the armor held. That was close, she said. Not close enough to worry about, he replied quickly, already shifting position. Finally, after what felt like minutes compressed into seconds, the last drone collapsed in a shower of sparks. The hall fell silent except for the sharp sound of breathing. David scanned the wreckage. These aren't standard attack drones, he said. Someone sent them here for a reason. Nara's eyes narrowed slightly. To disrupt the talks, or to take me. Either way, David said. We keep moving. They continued toward the command center. The halls here were narrower, with side rooms leading to storage areas and small offices. The architecture changed too, the clean lines giving way to older stone walls in places. Halfway through the 4th hall, the sound of grinding metal came from behind them. The wrecked drones in the previous hall were moving again, or rather, pieces of them were crawling forward, small spider-like repair units trying to rebuild the damage. They're reactivating, David said. We have to hurry. Nara moved faster, leading them into a larger chamber. The walls here were lined with tall shelves filled with old communication devices and sealed crates. At the far end stood another heavy door, but its control panel flickered with a red lock symbol. They've locked it, she said. David stepped forward, studying the panel. Can you override it? I can try, she replied, pressing her hand to the crystal interface. Symbols appeared, shifting as she worked through the security layers. The sound of metal scraping grew louder. The spider units had followed them, and with them came the faint mechanical hum of something bigger approaching. David positioned himself in the doorway they had just entered, his rifle aimed down the hall. The injured guard took cover beside a crate, while the other guard moved to help Nara. One of the smaller units skittered into view. David fired once, the shot shattering it into pieces. But more appeared, crawling quickly over the floor and walls. Almost. There, Nara said, her fingers moving swiftly across the glowing symbols. A shadow filled the far end of the hall. Another heavy drone, its frame wider than the doorway. David's shot struck its armor, but it kept coming. 30 seconds, Nara called. That's too long. David muttered, stepping back just enough to reload. Hold them. The guard beside him fired his energy weapon, slowing the advance. Of the smaller units, the heavy drone aimed its cannon, the blast shaking the shells as it struck. 10 seconds. Nara shouted. David shifted position, firing at the drone's optics. The glowing lens shattered, but the machine kept moving, forward blindly, guided by sensors deeper in its frame. Then, with a soft chime, The heavy door behind them unlocked. Go. Nara ordered. David moved first, covering the others as they rushed through. The heavy drone fired one last shot, the blast striking the floor where Nara had been seconds earlier. The door slid shut behind them, sealing with a deep thud. They stood in a smaller, brightly lit room, the outer chamber of the command center. For the first time since the attack began, the walls felt secure. David lowered his rifle slowly, his eyes still on the door. "You did well," he said, glancing at Nara. She met his gaze evenly. "And you kept them away from me," neither said. The rest, that without each other, the fight might have ended differently. The marble path of the courtyard stretched ahead, but the secure wing still felt far away. David kept his rifle ready, his eyes scanning every shadow. The courtyard's open sky gave him no comfort. If drones had breached the palace walls, they could also drop from above. Princess Nara walked beside him, her staff held firmly. Her movements were graceful, but her steps were quicker than usual. She kept her head high, refusing to show fear. Yet she could not ignore the heavy thud of her own heartbeat. Behind them, two of her Valyrian guards followed, their silver armor catching the pale light. The other two had stayed behind to delay them. Next wave of drones. Nara knew what that meant. They might never rejoin them. "This way," she said, pointing toward a narrow archway at the far side of the courtyard. David glanced at it, then at the open space between them and the arch. "Too exposed," he muttered. "We move fast." They crossed the courtyard quickly, boots and sandals clicking against the polished stone. Halfway through, a faint buzzing reached David's ears. He didn't stop walking, but his grip on the rifle tightened. From the roofline above, two small drones dropped, spinning as they descended. Their weapons glinted in the light. "Down!" David shouted. Nara reacted instantly, lowering herself beside one of the guards as David fired upward. His first shot hit the lead drone, sending it tumbling in smoke. The second drone swerved, firing a burst of red plasma toward them. The Valyrian guard raised a small energy shield, the blast splashing harmlessly against its surface. David aimed again, firing in controlled bursts until the second drone collapsed onto the courtyard tiles. They didn't pause to look at the wreckage. Within seconds, they were through the archway, entering a dim passageway lined with old stone walls. "This corridor," Nara said softly, "is part of the original palace. Few know of it now. It leads toward the eastern watchtower, then into the secure wing." David nodded, checking behind them before moving forward. "Stay in the center of the path. Walls could hide openings." They walked quickly, their footsteps echoing. The corridor was narrow, forcing them to stay close. David's shoulder brushed hers once as they turned a corner, and she felt an odd sense of reassurance in the contact. The air here was cooler, with a faint scent of age, the smell of stone that had stood for centuries. Torches and silver holders provided a soft, steady glow. After a few minutes, they reached a section where the passage split into two paths. One led upward toward the tower. The other curved deeper into the palace's lower levels. Nara hesitated. Both reached the secure wing, but the lower path is longer. David listened. Above, faint mechanical sounds echoed through the stone. He didn't like the idea of heading straight toward the noise. "We take the lower route," he decided. They moved into the left-hand path, the light dimming as they went. Deeper, the ceiling lowered, forcing David to duck slightly. Here, the air was stiller, the silence heavier. Nara kept glancing at him in the faint light. He didn't speak much, but every movement he made was precise, scanning corners, adjusting his aim, pausing to listen when something didn't feel right. In moments like this, she understood why humans had earned a reputation for being survivors. They didn't just fight, they adapted. After some time, a soft metallic scrape sounded from ahead. David raised a hand, signaling for them to stop. He moved forward slowly, pressing himself to the wall as he peered around the next bend. A single drone hovered near the far end of the corridor, scanning the walls with a red beam. Its posture was strange, as if it was searching for something specific. David lowered his voice. "One target, 20 meters. I can take it." But before he could fire, the drone rotated, its sensors locking on them. A high-pitched alarm emitted. From its core, "Move," David ordered. They rushed forward, David firing in short bursts. The first shot struck the drone's weapon arm, making it spin wildly. The second pierced its center, sending it crashing to the floor. The echo of its alarm faded. But David knew it had already sent a signal to others. "We need to move faster," he said. The corridor narrowed again, forcing them into single file. David led, the princess close behind, followed by the two remaining guards. They reached a section where the walls opened slightly, revealing a side chamber filled with old crates and tools. David stopped just long enough to check that no threat was hiding there. As he turned back, he caught Nara watching him. She quickly looked away, but not before he saw the faintest curve of her lips. Not a smile, exactly, but something close. When they resumed walking, Nara felt the urge to speak. "You move through these halls as if you've been here before," she said quietly. David kept his eyes ahead, training. "Once you've been through enough places, you learn to read them. Still," she said, "this is my home. And yet, I think you notice more than I do." He didn't answer right away, but when he did, his tone was steady. "That's my job." Finally, a faint light appeared ahead, the end of the lower passage. They stepped out into a small stone courtyard inside the eastern section of the palace. Beyond it, a heavy metal door marked the entrance to the secure wing. But the moment they approached, the sound of machinery rose again. From a side archway, 3 more drones skittered out, their weapons already glowing. David didn't hesitate. "Stay behind me," he said sharply. The princess obeyed without argument. The Varian guards moved to flank David, their energy weapons humming. The fight was quick but fierce. One guard was knocked back by a blast, his armor smoking. But David and the remaining guard pushed forward. David's shots were precise, each one hitting where it mattered. In less than a minute, the drones were scrap on the floor, breathing. Hard but steady, David lowered his rifle. "Door," he said to Nara. She stepped forward, placing her hand on a crystal panel beside the entrance. The door unlocked with a soft chime, sliding open to reveal a brightly lit interior. As they stepped inside, the noise of the battle outside faded. The air was warmer here. The floor smooth and clean, for the first time since the attack began. They could breathe without rushing. Nara looked at David. "You protected me without hesitation," she said quietly. He gave a small shrug. "That's what I'm here for." But she knew it was more than that, and so did he. The night on Asterion was quieter than usual. The tall crystal trees swayed gently, their glowing leaves sending ripples of light into the darkness. The air smelled faintly of sweet minerals, and the ground shimmered as if dusted with stardust. "Princess." Arya stood on the balcony of her private chamber, dressed not in royal robes, but in a plain travel cloak. Her mind was restless. Ever since the battle at the canyon, she had felt something change not only in her people's struggle, but also within herself. Down in the courtyard, Captain Rion stood guard. He wasn't wearing his usual battle armor. Instead, he was in a simple black uniform, his rifle slung lazily over his shoulder. He looked up once, catching sight of her, and gave a small nod. It was not the gesture of a subject to a ruler, it was the quiet acknowledgement of one comrade to another. Arya turned back to the stars. "I cannot stand idle anymore," she whispered to herself. "This is my fight too." Only moments later, she descended the spiral stairs, her footsteps echoing softly against the crystal floor. Rian noticed her approach and raised an eyebrow. "Your Highness," he said, his tone half question, half warning, "you should be resting." "I've rested enough," she replied firmly. "Rian, tomorrow I will be on the front lines." He frowned. "It's too dangerous. Your people need their princess alive, not risking her life in a trench." Arya stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "And what kind of princess hides while her people bleed?" Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from determination. For a long moment, Rian said nothing. Then he let out a sigh. "If you're going, you're not going alone." That night, they walked through the silent royal gardens. The silver light of Asterion's twin moons painted their faces in soft blue glow. Arya spoke of her childhood, how she had watched the stars from this very place, dreaming of peace. Rian listened, his usual guarded demeanor softening. When I first came here, he admitted, I thought your people saw humans as nothing more than crude warriors. But you've shown me something different. Arya tilted her head slightly. And what do you see now? He looked away, as if embarrassed by his own thoughts. I see why this planet is worth fighting for. Later, inside the Old War archive, they studied holographic maps together. The maps glowed faintly, showing enemy positions and defense lines. Arya traced her finger along a path leading to the enemy's supply route. If we can cut this, she said, we can slow them down without risking a full assault. Rian studied the route. It's risky, but possible. You need a diversion here. He pointed to a narrow ridge and a small strike force moving fast. You and I could lead it, she said without hesitation. He gave her a sharp look. You really mean to put yourself in harm's way? I mean to save my people, she corrected him. As they worked, the glow of the holograms reflected in their eyes. For a moment, Arya forgot the titles, the war, the politics. Here, they were simply to people, one human soldier, one alien princess sharing the same resolve. Finally, Rian straightened. If we do this, we need an oath. Something binding, no turning back. Arya's brows lifted. An oath? He nodded. Where I'm from, soldiers swear under the open sky before going into a mission they might not return from. Arya stepped outside with him, into the cool night air. Above them, the twin moons shone brightly, surrounded by thousands of glittering stars. Rian placed his fist over his heart. I swear to protect you, fight beside you, and see this through no matter what happens. Arya looked at him for a long moment, then mirrored the gesture. And I swear to fight for my people, to protect your life as you protect mine, and to see our mission through. Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither of them felt the divide between their worlds. Just before dawn, they gathered supplies and prepared for the mission. Rian adjusted his rifle while Arya checked the small energy blade strapped to her arm. She had never carried a weapon before. Now it felt strangely natural. You ready? Rian asked. More than ever, she replied. As they mounted the small hovercraft, Arya glanced back at the palace one last time. The rising light of dawn reflected on its crystal spires, making them glow like fire. Rian noticed her lingering gaze. We'll bring it back in one piece, he said. Arya smiled faintly. I know. With that, they rode into the misty horizon, the sound of the hovercraft's engine fading into the quiet of the morning. The war was far from over, but tonight, beneath the stars, two different worlds had made a promise, and promises, Arya knew, could change the fate of galaxies. The night sky over the plains of Varelia was lit by the twin moons. The air was cool, but there was no peace. In the distance, the ground trembled. The alien invaders were coming. Their war machines rolled forward, each step like the beat of a giant drum. Inside the defense camp, lanterns flickered. Soldiers moved quickly, preparing weapons and setting up barricades. Mira stood at the edge of the camp, looking out toward the dark horizon. Her silver armor reflected the moonlight. She was no longer just a princess, she was a commander now. Beside her, Daniel tightened the straps of his battle gear. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of everything they had been through. You don't have to fight in the front lines, he told her quietly. Your people need you alive. Mira, she turned to him, her expression firm. And your people need you alive too. But here we are. A faint smile crossed his face. Guess neither of us listens to reason. The sound of an approaching scout broke their short moment. A young alien soldier ran up and saluted. Princess, Captain, the enemy will reach us in less than an hour. They have more numbers than expected. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Mira. We'll hold, she said without hesitation, no matter what it takes. The calm before the storm camp fell into a tense silence as the minutes passed. The soldiers, human and alien alike, stood side by side. Over the past weeks, differences in culture had faded. Now they were one force. They had learned each other's battle signs, shared food, shared stories, and even laughter. Daniel walked among the lines, checking weapons and encouraging the younger fighters. Some of them were barely more than teenagers, but their faces showed determination. Mira moved through the alien units, her voice steady and strong. We fight not just for our homes, but for each other, today. We prove that we will not break. Her words spread like fire through the troops. Fear was still there, but it no longer ruled them. The enemy Ariva's first shadow of the enemy fleet appeared over the ridge. Giant metal walkers loomed in the darkness, glowing with red lights. Behind them, ranks of armored soldiers marched. In perfect formation, a deep horn echoed from the enemy's side, shaking the ground. Daniel raised his weapon. Positions. The defenders raised their rifles and plasma spears. The barricades bristled with cannons. The air was thick with tension. Then the first shot rang out. The battle exploded. Chaos in the field, flashes of light tore through the night. The roar of cannons mixed with the metallic screech of machines. Daniel led the first counterattack, charging toward a damaged walker to plant explosives at its joints. The blast sent it crashing into the dirt, but another took its place immediately. Mira fought in the center, her twin blades spinning with deadly grace. Every movement was precise. Her armor glinting in the firelight, she felt the burn in her muscles, but she kept moving. Around her, alien and human soldiers fought side by side, covering each other's backs. An enemy shell struck near the barricade, throwing dust and debris into the air. Mira's ears rang, but she pushed forward. She spotted Daniel being surrounded and charged to his side, cutting down the attackers before they could strike. "Thanks," he said. Catching his breath, "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "We're not done." Holding the Linehauers passed, though it felt like minutes. The ground was littered with smoking metal and craters. The defenders were exhausted, but the enemy kept pressing forward. A sudden explosion tore through the left flank. The alien troops there began to fall back. Mira could see the fear in their eyes. If the enemy broke through, the camp would be lost. She didn't hesitate. "With me," she shouted. Rallying a group of soldiers, together they rushed to plug the gap. Daniel joined them, firing steadily as they pushed the enemy back inch by inch. Every step forward felt like lifting a mountain, but they held. The turning point just as the enemy began to push again. A loud hum filled the air. Mira looked up to see bright lights cutting through the clouds. A fleet of allied ships descended from the sky, opening fire on the enemy lines. Reinforcements had arrived. The sight renewed the defenders' strength. With fresh energy, they launched a final coordinated strike. Daniel and Mira led from the front, their movements almost in sync. The enemy, now caught between ground forces and the new aerial assault, began to falter. One by one, their war machines fell. Victory and silence when the last enemy machine collapsed. The battlefield fell silent except for the crackle of fires. The defenders stood in shock, unable to believe it was finally over. Daniel lowered his weapon. Breathing heavily, Mira looked around at the faces of the survivors, tired, bruised, but alive. "We did it," she said quietly. Daniel gave a small nod. "No, you did it. Your people stood because of you." She shook her head. "No, we stood because of us." Together, a new future. Days later, the camp was no longer a war camp. It had become a gathering place. Humans and aliens worked side by side to rebuild. Walls that had once divided them were gone. Daniel and Mira stood on a hill overlooking the valley. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold. "Do you think peace will last?" Daniel asked. Mira smiled softly. "If we keep choosing to stand together, yes." They stood there in silence for a while, watching the light spread across the land, a land that was now theirs to protect, not as separate worlds, but as one.